Okay, are we live? We're going? Okay, I guess we're on time here. All right, hi everyone. I'm Robert Gerard Pietrusko. I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm happy to be moderating the panel, How Water Calculates. And we have four fantastic artist researchers with us here today. I'm going to just quickly read some bios, and then I'll sort of jump into the sort of intro framing of this. Okay, you've heard your bio a couple times today, I imagine. In any case, so what we'll do, I'm going to say some introductory remarks, and then each of our guests are going to make a short presentation, between 5-7 minutes or so, describing one of their projects and their general approach to things. And then I have a set of prompts, and we'll just sort of see where the conversation goes over the next 90 minutes, which feels interminably long, but I mean, I imagine we'll get some good stuff out of it. Anyway, so we're going to start with Amer. Amer Kanngieser is an award-winning geographer and sound artist. They're the Marie Curie Fellow in Geography at Royal Holloway University of London. Amer works through listening and attunement to approach the relations between people, place, and ecologies. Over the past decade, they have focused on experimenting with sonic methods and practices for environmental geography research. They are the author of Experimental Politics and the Making of Worlds from 2013, and Between Sound and Silence, Listening Towards Environmental Relations, which is forthcoming. They have published in a range of interdisciplinary journals, including South Atlantic Quarterly and Wire's Climate Change. They are a co-founder of the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures, and their audio work has been commissioned by Documenta 14 Radio, BBC 3, ABC Radio National, the Natural History Museum in London, Deutschland Radio, amongst others. And their radio art piece, And Then the Sea Came Back, was jury nominated at the 2017 Prix Ars Electronica in Austria. And they've been featured in international arts and music publications, including The Wire, Quietus, and Art Quarterly magazines. Great, welcome, thank you. Just immediately to my right here, we have Hsin, who's an artist and filmmaker based here in Berlin. She approaches ecology from the point of view of its close relationship with technology, and her artistic practice is strongly research-oriented and involves fieldwork where she investigates the political ecologies of water. Her work reflects on technology and the critical infrastructure in which the human and non-human converge. Her analytical and hydropoetic storytelling, I love that, hydropoetic storytelling focuses on map-making, operational photography, and the technical production of geographical knowledge. Her film and video installations are exhibited worldwide in museums and international art biennales, for instance at the Centre Pompidou in Metz, the Museum of Contemporary Arts, Busan, Taipei Biennale in 2020, ZKM in Karlsruhe, UCCA, Center for Contemporary Art, and Haus der Kultur der Welt. Sorry, I mean, obviously I don't speak German, among others. Recently, she has had her solo exhibition, Wet Mechanics of Seeing, in Kunsthal Winterthur. Great, welcome. Okay. So Antonia Hernández is next, hello. She's a Montreal-based Chilean artist and researcher, and a FQRSC postdoctoral fellow at McGill University. Antonio mixes art practice and theoretical investigations, and her current research explores the grammar and poetics of governance. Her research interrogates the ways in which technological infrastructures are inhabited, their vital and relational dimension. She is intrigued by the adoption and naturalization of technologies through daily habits and how discourses get materialized and performed. For these reasons, media and technologies experienced at an intimate level have been her constant areas of research, where opportunities to observe and experience attachments, affective engagements, innovative uses, and resistances are always present. Simultaneously, because of the complex environment in which intimate technologies unfold, they offer multiple occasions to see discourses enacted and made structural through repetition and enforcement. Great, welcome.
Thank you.
And then lastly, Laura Cugusi is an artist, writer, and researcher. Her practice has been nomadic across languages, disciplines, and media. Her work focuses on mapping media ecologies, developing interdisciplinary curricula for tech literacies, and speculating on the design of governance infrastructure. Laura's most recent research looks at the meta-narratives of knowledge production and circulation, and at the ways in which institutional world-building strategies shape, consolidate, or interrupt the imagination, or lack thereof, about the future. She works with artists, collectives, international organizations, academic and art institutions, and media platforms in a variety of countries, including Italy, Egypt, Spain, Germany, and the UK, and the larger Mediterranean region as well. Laura's writing and photography have been featured in numerous journals and books, including the book Between the Material and the Possible, Infrastructural Reexamination and Speculation in Art on Sternberg from 2021. And Dissonant Archives, Knowledge Production and Contested Narratives in the Middle East on Taurus from 2015. She has presented her research at institutions, conferences, and festivals, such as the Tbilisi Architectural Biennale, the Fiber Festival, the former Strelka Institute in Moscow, RIP, and the Matadero Media Lab. It has been exhibited at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Nile Sunset Annex, and the Venice Biennale, among others. In 2021, Laura designed and curated a series of online discussions and workshops to map and highlight the work of independent practitioners and organizations working on creative tech, digital rights, interactive storytelling, and media literacy with a focus on linguistic diversity. That's great. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
Okay. So, what are we doing here? Does water calculate? Maybe we'll even answer that. At least how. How and does. Water is an indicator, a sign of the possibility of planetary life. Water as we know it is a modern abstraction. We're going to be talking a lot about that. And we believe digital tools help us understand how water moves, stays still, and changes state. But these tools have been developed with a diagrammatic knowledge of water that is considered to be a universal portrayal of the states of water, despite having been modeled after conditions specific to discrete parts of the world. Inherent in this are questions of scale, instance versus type, case study versus condition, particular versus universal. When considering some of the ideas present here and looking at the work of my colleagues on stage here, I was reminded of Deleuze and Guattari's maritime model. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and it's not the 90s, but the clearest presentation of their concept of the smooth and striated. I always liked the maritime model because it was very clear. For them, the ocean was the first literal space onto which the repetitive cycles of undifferentiation, individuation, and rationalization were cyclically enacted. So tellingly, the maritime model presents water as a terrain that one can traverse. And we sort of start with a historical unfolding of aquatic traversal. Navigation first based on the wind and noise, colors and sounds of the sea, kind of immersion in the affect. Then we move into a pre-astronomical version where one only employs latitude in order to get to where they're going. And then finally, the state we find ourselves in now, the ocean being fully mapped. Navigation is constructed through latitude, longitude, pinned down with GPS coordinates and all the rest of it. And then we have this moment, this undermining, which they call submarines. What are the technologies and techniques that we introduce to make space smooth again, to undermine latitude, longitude, to undermine visibility? To make the ocean unknowable again and to traverse it in ways that precede all of those grids. The ocean and water in general is the original media from which all life emerges. Initially an immersive milieu and therefore somewhat invisible to us. We hear it in sort of cliches by saying it's the water we swim in when we talk about things that determine our situation and yet we don't have direct access to them. But then later water becomes something alienated from us. It's instrumentalized and at times even made adversarial. So first, we might see water as infrastructure, a system of communication and transport, and that's where the maritime model comes in. Later, it becomes a grab bag of abundance full of potential commodities and resources. It might even be a void into which one dumps the externalities and excesses of industrial production, as we see just massive amounts of garbage collected in the Pacific Ocean. And then even more recently, in the face of climate change, in the face of climate change and extreme storm events, sea level rise, water has become an invading enemy, an adversary against which we mount dynamic simulations, seawalls, berms, and insurance policies. So what applies to the ocean applies equally to water in general at a variety of scales. And to paraphrase urbanist Dilip da Cunha, the world is an undifferentiated condition of continuous levels of wetness. And it is within that continuum that techniques of mapping, stratification, classification, and simulation have all been applied to make water occupiable, quantifiable, and ultimately manageable. Themes that we've heard throughout the rest of the conference this week, but also themes that are going to come up in today's discussion. So each of our artists have worked on these topics through a variety of means. Research, fieldwork, artistic practices of sound and video, writing, and something about the media of dealing with water is, I think, part of the conversation we're going to have today, too. So welcome to each of you, and I'm looking forward to hearing your sort of presentations about this, and then we'll start the conversation. Great. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
So sorry.
Hi, Bobby. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks to everybody being here. I'm sorry for those who were here in the last one, because you'll hear me say some similar things. Anyway, as Bobby kind of already flagged a little bit, and as I had talked about in the last panel, for the past several years, I've been working in the Pacific, predominantly with Pacific queer women, queer and transgender artists, organizers and scholars to amplify movements for self-determination and liberation in the face of resource extraction, environmental racism, and ecological disaster. In the work that I do with Pacific communities, I'm interested in asking questions around the histories and struggles that are held in water and the relationships that are sustained within and through water. And today, hopefully, I'm interested in talking about as well is how do Pacific understandings, Indigenous Pacific understandings of water antagonize Anglo-European attempts to claim and to know water, to define water and contain it within certain onto-epistemological kinds of ways. So the Pacific region, for those of you who might not be so familiar with it, has for many years now been susceptible to a number of devastating changes due to man-made climate change, including sea level rise, erosion, intensifying droughts, floods, earthquakes, cyclones, and tsunamis. This is why nations of the Pacific, like other large ocean states, which are seen as developing states, are held up as case studies for vulnerability. Through this lens of vulnerability, the Sea of Islands that Pacific poet and educator Epeli Hau'ofa spoke about becomes reduced to the limited perspective of islands in a far sea, which emphasizes remoteness and marginality over autonomy and self-determination. To counter the narrow definitions of resilience and vulnerability that the region tends to get pushed into through government policy, academic and NGO discourses, in my work, I try to showcase the nuanced and variegated ways that people understand, produce knowledge about, and collectively attend to their lived experiences of ecocide. So in my work, my approach to engaging with people's experiences centers around listening and sound. In Pacific cultures, it is impossible to separate land from oceans, people, plants, animals, and spiritual worlds. Kanai Helu Thaman tells us that, and I quote, Pacific notions of identity tend to emphasize the environment in its totality, a concept for which the English term land is grossly inadequate. In Fijian Itaukei, the word vanua, says Unaisi Nambombombaba, denotes, and quoting her, land and place, everything on it and in it, all flora and fauna as well as waterways, oceans, mountains, and forests. Land is of physical, social, and spiritual significance to people. Working through listening and sound methods allows me to hold these relations together gently without separating people from their specific places and experiences. And in my work, I predominantly at this point work with oral testimony and field recordings. And oral testimony here refers to audio recorded interviews, poetry, songs, and other kind of archival recordings as well. And field recordings are recordings of environments. So weaving together these methods of oral testimony and field recordings through sonic ethnographies, I'm able to move towards building what Métis fish philosopher Zoe Todd calls kin studies. And she defines these as thoughtful, careful, and plural hyperlocal ethnographies to counter the ways that the overwhelmingly white, Eurocentric academic and global policy discourses of global warming erase the local specific experiences of devastation faced by marginalized communities. And by way of introduction, rather than trying to describe or explain this anymore, I want to just play a short excerpt from the piece Mining the Deep, which was co-produced with Joey Tao, who works with the Pacific Network on Globalization and communities predominantly from the Duke of York Islands in Papua New Guinea. And it's a soundscape documentary weaving together stories about resistance to deep seabed mining, both in Papua New Guinea and Vanuatu, and it features the voices of directly affected communities, as well as ongoing voices from people doing ongoing campaigning and government leaders as well. So I'm just going to play a very short excerpt from that. This is a photo of the campaign against deep seabed mining. And how do I make it? Where's the little thing? Yeah. And the transcript is up there as well.
Just now, we know that they are testing this sea. It's the first testing here, and it's 30 kilometers away. We never had this information.
Didn't come to our notice. Maybe they gone to other islands at the back, to Miyoko. They have gone to those atolls, islands at the back, but they didn't, we didn't receive some of those people coming this way, to our ward especially.
I don't know about other parts of this world where they have experienced such deep sea mining. We are the first people to then they would like to introduce this. You know, deep sea mining, I think this is the first time ever to introduce deep sea mining. It's like an experiment, and we are human beings, we are not animals. They would do experiments, So we strongly oppose this deep sea mining business because we don't want to be displaced off this island. We want to live happily on this island.
Our traditions in here, we normally work together. Like if I said a clan, we work together, or a family, we work together. If we need a shortage of something like water or whatever, we share water together. We share food together. It's like a thing that we normally work out together, and that it's not a problem to us, but like a big something that is trying to come, like a deep sea, that will be a big problem to us too. So that because the only source of our proteins in the island is we normally go out at sea. And if something that comes like a sea mining, that will really bad effect to us. I think that's a big problem now.
So that's just a very short excerpt from a larger 20-minute piece, which, as I said before, weaves together field recordings and oral testimonies from people that have been involved in campaigning. And you can hear the rest of that on my website, but I will leave it there. Thank you.
me. Okay.
I can pass it down to you, and I'm just going to acknowledge something.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, actually, I think
one
I'm sorry, it's Laura who's
Ah.
next. In terms
Okay.
of-
Okay, okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Sorry, on the fly, everyone.
One second. Does it?
You want me to take this for you? I can take
I can just like change the slide like this, no?
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. And so, as Robert said, in my studies and my work, my studies and my work have been quite nomadic across different languages and disciplines and media. And as someone born in an island, the sea and water have always been a defining element in my work and in my research interests, both as a physical border and in the ways in which it evades representation with its extreme mutability. For many years, I worked on documenting routes and maps of irregular migration via the Mediterranean Sea, questioning the role of different forms of archiving in filling the gaps of collective memory and history. I was also looking at the history and geography of underwater infrastructures that make the transmission and storage of information and archives possible. So the point of departure of this art and research project has been that of documentary, but the more information we collected, categorized, and the less we could summarize and encode into different legible formats. So thinking of the sea and water as an archive has been a useful metaphor to understand that knowledge is always unstable and constantly shifting. Also as an archive of histories that leave no trace, and of events and phenomena that are not accounted for in the sets of data that build the dominant narratives and models of the world. Also the sea as a metaphor for thinking of how the gap in translation between languages and media formats, including the languages we use to communicate with machines, complicate the notion of value and of what constitutes scientific evidence. So recently I have been more interested in mapping the fragmented and often obscure entities benefiting from knowledge extraction and infrastructural control, as well as the institutional meta-narratives of scenario planning and modeling in the field of artificial intelligence and climate governance. Looking at how multiple agents leverage on their exclusive access to remote sensing, image synthesis, and tech design techniques to narrate their particular version of reality. For example, how representational and aesthetic practices, including, but not limited to geospatial technologies, mapping, simulation, and data visualization, reveal arbitrary modes of looking which are systematized and applied as design and research methodologies, with claims of universality. So while the digital spaces are becoming the new frontiers where institutions can legitimize their existence, the practices of futurology and world building themselves are haunted by binary models and cultural hegemonic and colonial practices. So as much as the present and the future are heavily shaped by algorithmic processes outside of democratic decision-making, they're also produced and perpetuated by discourse and rhetoric and by gestures and rituals that corporate and state institutions regularly perform. In the context of this research collaboration with Antonia, we have been thinking about water as an operational metaphor and at how attempts at capturing its dynamic physical states can recursively inform the language that composes the legislative framework of governance models. We have been looking at the ways in which the mutable nature of water and natural elements complicate the applicability of binary categories and reveal the inconsistencies of particular disciplinary specialisms and their tendencies towards epistemic entrenchment. For example, systems of governance and of territories, phenomena, and resources that evade national constraints. In the different iterations of this project, I am interested in exploring the implication of these premises in site-specific scenarios by mapping a series of current crises occurring at transnational planetary scale that are exacerbated by both natural and artificial scarcity of resources and liquid sovereignty disputes. These multiple crises make visible the transnational dimension of media and knowledge ecologies and underline the certainty of the impermanence of value across time. Thank you.
What is mine? Okay. Okay.
Shall I hold it for you?
I think it's just the.
Yeah.
I think it's the following one. It's just
Okay.
a video. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very looking forward to this conversation. And so, as Robert was saying, my research has been focused on the poetic of governance. So that means the forms that governance acquire and the types of engagement with those forms. In that way, this research started for me as an attempt to think about water governance through water. But as we know, water changed everything, and the very idea of governance regarding water becomes disrupted. So thinking about hydrocommons as a type of water governance is an exercise in which Laura and I engaged since we met in the last Transmediale last year. The strategy has been to think about hydrocommons as common attitude and imagination toward water. So we are like exploring those imaginaries. So how water is imagined and how those imaginations unfold both in time and space. So in that sense, imaginary is not necessarily unreal, and it matters. So it matters how matter is imagined. This investigation builds on the idea that if imagination is contextual and historical, so it is matter, and it's imagination. As such, this research explored how water conforms and is conceived in different knowledge regimes for the construction of history, politics, and belief. At the same time, new environmental conditions produce new contexts, disrupting sense-making habits and giving new meaning to all rituals. In that sense, I am interested in what Sarabon calls inverse performativity, where instead of knowledge creating worlds in their image, unruly worlds create new knowledge landscapes. So this is why this research attempts to engage in a sort of post-material stance, where water is understood as matter, but this matter is neither the ultimate truth nor a construct, but something in between that informs and modulates relationships and meaning. And challenging the only positive connotation that sometimes we attribute to water, also thinking about water meanings as something that results for those engagement. So this entails paying more attention to how the conflicting ethical meaning of water need not to be alternative, but can be evaluation and orientation that coexist within people's practices. So rather than exploring substances, I am interested in hydrosocialities, or what anthropologist Andrea Ballestero described as water choreographies or hydrochoreographies. So the joys and the horrors of the hydrosphere. Engagement with water that involves matter, but also abstraction and everyday habits. So for grounding these claims and trying to stretch the imaginary for thinking about hydrocommons, two different imaginations toward water were explored in the artwork exhibit down in the corridor. The first one was water as something sacred, which is a common and widespread belief that involves geographies, trajectories, politics, and rituals. The other one was water as a commodity. In this articulation or this hydrochoreography, the this choreography links the ideas from the Chicago School of Economics, their enforced legality during the Chilean dictatorship, and the current situation in a Chilean valley where a mega drought collides with avocado monoculture, farming, and a superfood hype, increasing social and economic inequalities and dramatically showing the spatial transformation of neoliberal politics. So this hydro choreography shows water binds temporalities, war-making practices, politics, environmental condition, infrastructure, migration, markets, and also the sociality of water bodies. So yeah, that's it.
Should I go?
No, this is a video that the next one is yours. Yeah.
I think, can I? Sorry. Yeah, good. Yes. Yeah, thanks, Bobby, for the introduction. And I just want to make sure if the microphone is okay. Yes, cool. Yeah, I'm Hsin, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction of my practice and also some ideas to blend into the following conversation. And yeah, it's just, I will read the script and kind of, yeah, let's start. Okay. Waters are plural. Waters only ever appear commingled with other substances and materials. Up to the time of the 18th and 19th centuries in the chemistry lab, water had been made, known as an abstraction, as H2O, a compound comprising a single atom of oxygen linked with 2 atoms of hydrogen. The advent of H2O, or in Jamie Linton's terms, modern water, drove out all the socially specific qualities of different waters. The different source of the waters, of we could say different holdings of the waters, have been reduced to this homogeneous chemical compound, spatially and temporally. Water has been fixed as a transparent, tasteless, and senseless compound, even though water is never found pure in nature. The waters holding things in a particular relational way to one another and us. The quest for pure water is part of the modern constitution of water, the epistemological constitution dividing the world of nature from the world of society. I come from a subtropical island born 6 million years ago in an ongoing collision of tectonic plates, the Pacific and the Eurasian, which causes intense seismic activity. The island's subtropical atmospheric condition, exposure to typhoons and heavy rains, and active geological features affected my elemental thinking with water. In recent years, my artistic research has questioned the politics of water and its abstraction, the epistemic and the aesthetic as the 2 sides of the water body's representation. Our physiological reality connects intimately to a meteorological and geophysical world. Considering rivers, lakes, water infrastructure, ocean currents, weather systems, and even global internet networks, thinking with planetary connectivity through waters help us to recognize that we are embodied and embedded as localized and globalized subjects, Different water bodies hold their own space and flow to each other. Different water bodies are carrier bags, holding and storing particles and always on the move. I'm thinking of the way sediments move down the river. As you can see in the image is the Liu River in Taiwan, in Taroko Gorge. Those solid bodies drifting within the flows. As sediment moves along the river, the interaction of particles is mediated by the water and air. In this sense, water is both media and medium. Water's gathering information technology through process of drifting, blending, dissolving, eroding, weathering, and sedimenting, etc. It is the water that makes the difference. In the past years, my main medium are SF film and filmmaking in the intersection of documentary and fiction along the concept of critical cartographies. And here are two questions which I will elaborate in the following conversation. How to restage the matters of fact and technological assemblage through the aesthetical move. In other words, how to destabilize the mechanism of reduction of waters in a material sense through thinking, researching, and storytelling to rearrange the matters in the words of entangled concerns. Yeah. Thank you. Is this yours?
So I think to get the conversation started, I love that in the kind of last paragraph there, you asked the question about restaging. And I thought I was going to start with a different question, but now I'm seeing kind of across all of the projects this interest in restaging, and maybe we can start here and see where it goes. And I'm going to begin then with a question for Amer. In your audio work that we just heard an excerpt from, Mining the Deep, you describe it as, quote, capturing and recreating the atmospheres of life affected by mining through sound. And so listening to the piece, the documentary approach, the sensory ethnographic approach, the oral testimonies, I imagine, and also sort of the field recordings, I'm assuming this is part of the kind of capturing. But then I'm also curious about this other technique, the recreating aspect. Are there parts of the soundscape that were synthesized newly for the piece? And then I'm going to sort of think down the line. Each of the projects takes a topic and restages it through a media that requires that you synthesize some aspects of it. You have to kind of work with water in a way that you stage it in order to film it or to write a libretto about it, or in your work, you're actively engaging in restaging. So I'm curious about that move of using staging and synthesizing as a tool of actually engaging research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, within the piece, it is based on field recordings and oral testimonies, and also a part of speaking to the communities about their experiences of deep seabed mining. So a lot of the deep seabed mining exploration was taking place was in an exploratory phase. So sounds have been synthesized in this following from descriptions that people from those communities gave of what they felt the sounds were. So I'm not going to talk about if people orally heard the sounds themselves, but the way that people spoke about the sounds that they were saying were happening underwater. They spoke about deep rumblings. They spoke about sounds that made like aquatic sea mammals beach themselves on shore. So they'd kind of said there'd been sharks, there'd been dolphins, porpoises, turtles, as well as like smaller fish and stuff beaching themselves on shore. There'd been a lot of descriptions of a sonic environment that they had heard or that they knew of that was happening under the water, right? And so the ways that then sounds were synthesized from the field recordings were following from what people's descriptions of those underwater sounds would be like. And it was very consistent what people were saying. Like they were talking about sounds of drilling and sounds of like deep rumbling, like kind of earthquake-like sounds, So there was a lot there to kind of draw from. You know, there was this kind of very intimate knowledge of what was being kind of transmitted on a sonic level through this exploration phase. You know, whether or not that's what the companies would say was happening at that time is really quite irrelevant, because that's the stories that people were telling me that they were hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that relates really interestingly to that idea of a common imagination, like mobilizing imagination and closing that gap between words and media that came up earlier. I'm wondering if there's some other comments along those lines.
Yeah, I think that, following our lead on sound, I think the sound piece that is in the corridor that was developed by Gabriel Viglianzoni, I think that encapsulate a lot this idea of how we make out of water and how we engage with the idea of water. So the idea was to produce a sense or like a feeling, a soothing feeling like water, but that if you pay attention, it's not composed out of water sounds or like field recording, but things that you can associate with coins and money and markets. So that kind of like unsettling experience with water was interesting. Was the goal, because yes, this imagination is at the same time common, abstract material made of ideas, daily engagement, grammars of calculation, and a lot of like different things that translate as material but are not necessarily experienced as material in the first place. So yeah, that.
Yeah, I think my practice is, as I mentioned, the intersection of documentary and fiction. And so I work with quite different media and usually start from site-specific research or field research, and in connection and also through like interview work to as Emma just mentioned, like sonic testimony, and also like collecting story and get the sense of the places and like working with local actors. And that is really part of the practice for me at the first stage of research. And also working with different media, with image archive materials, etc. And so in this, as we mentioned about restaging and how we can get relation to this unmapped location and also marginalized voices. I think this practice with restaging, for me, is like play an important role to mediate and to through this construction of staging to in a way of storytelling and make it to this side of position of viewpoint to get relation to that. Yeah, so I think I will go back to water a bit later, but I would like to pass it to other people.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like restaging and reassembling the like in basic elements and going back to basic elements, like the point of departure for this research was to look at systems of like not only the legal terminology and like the legal framework of like the commons and planetary resources, but also the language that frames the spectrum of like what is private property, what is the commons, what can be appropriated and extracted. And so throughout the research for the project, we're thinking of like a speculative scenario for like a system of governance of water resources. But then we've been looking at a lot of legal texts and documents and the structure of the and the institutional framework of the governance. So, for example, of the areas beyond the national jurisdiction. And so it's very interesting to look at the poetic license of all the different terms that are used to identify something that is portrayed and described as if it's like a matter of fact and an objective scientific evidence, objective scientific knowledge. And so we were trying to, in a way, restage this in a fictional, poetic license scenario in which to reveal somehow the performativity of this and the arbitrariness with which all of these laws and governance infrastructures are performed like in practice. And we will also go back to some examples of that because, for example, in the text that we used for the libretto, the publication that is in the installation, I was looking at the failure of ratifying the mining code, the mining treaty for the exploration of the seabed, and looking at how there are tens of different acronyms to identify different structures of governance and of that refer to specific resources, in which it's very difficult to understand which one has de facto power of enforcement. So yeah, we'll go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, there's something in that last point. You were saying that there's all these different words for describing what everyone assumes is sort of a stable entity. And I'm reminded of, the term Susan Lee Starr uses, boundary object, which we love that, right? That is something that has certain material properties, and yet different institutions project their own kind of cosmologies onto it, and it's hard to pin down precisely what it is. And it's always a language game, and there's productive slippages between those. And if we think of the work that you all are doing, of course it's completely different from each other, but imagining that there's a different institution which is sort of artistic and aesthetic, an institution of artistic and aesthetic engagement with water. I wonder then how we think about knowledge creation. That if it is research, and I mean, absolutely it is. I mean, we're trying to get after this through other means. And we're challenging how the need for knowledge, or perhaps the need for more information, the way that institutions talk about this stuff as information about water, is important for them to occupy it, to territorialize it, to manage it. They measure it not in a way that's about accuracy. They manage it, they classify it in a way that's not about accuracy. They're not after some scientific truth of water. They're after useful categories that allow their internal organizational procedures to kind of run without any salt in the gears. And by having these categories and these types of measurements that are highly idiosyncratic to different institutions, different industries, different organizations, they all render water as artificially discrete, bounded, and classifiable. So we've been hearing the word abstraction for a while. And all research is, of course, about knowledge, and it can take different forms. So, I mean, here's the part where I get to the actual question. In your work, what do you feel counts as knowledge? Right? So is it locally bounded? Is it about an experience? Is it knowledge that comes specifically for the person doing the work in the field? Or is it allowed to circulate? We're seeing in your work, you guys are circulating it. So we see certain mediums. And by what means and mediums is knowledge in your work made transportable? How does it become social? How can it be communicated elsewhere? And how does it persist in time without succumbing to the same issues of abstraction we are challenging more generally? And sort of what I mean by that is that in order to make it something that can go out and circulate and connect to other questions, other discourses, other disciplines, we need a set of kind of stable categories. And suddenly our work is kind of caught up in the same language game of those institutions that we're challenging. So I'm just curious if there are thoughts on that or how you grapple with that in your work as practitioners. And I mean, I can...
It's very interesting, the question, and it's very interesting to think about that question through water, or attempting to think that through water, which is obviously another abstraction, but it's is an interesting one or a productive one. And if we do that, we should renunciate the idea of having stable forms, because water is not stable, and also it's at the same time like a universal. Well, we don't know universal, but at least like global, but mutate across context, and permeates and infiltrates and dries and evaporates. So that kind of like a metaphor are interesting for thinking at the same time as something that we can think as more or less stable and contextual, but when you change the context, you're changing the element and also the social relations that water engage with other water bodies and other bodies of water. So I think it's interesting to think in things that make sense, are useful in particular context, and can incarnate or embody also universal that you want to promote, like human rights or that kind of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to add that, yeah, I agree that it's really about it's the issue of language, and also this, as I mentioned in the introduction, like this language or this abstraction that water had been, as you mentioned, about stable, but also like I think, and also it's because it's unstable, so it had been fixed in this scientific representation of water as H2O. And I think that that also going to a bit back to how we say about restaging is also this work, like this practice to try to destabilize this fixation, this fixed and solid scientific representation of water. And I think I can give a brief example of my recent project that I'm looking into the water usage in semiconductor manufacturing, and how they use ultra pure water to in their production process. And this ultra pure water is the manifestation of scientific representation of water in H2O. Is just purely with economic identity with H2O, only hydrogen and oxygen molecules. And that is also like as an example that water have been used just as a tool and have been fixed in its usage, only used for cleansing and also manufacturing, but also it have been erased all this particle and also like its memory, where it traveled to, where it carries on like water as a holding body, but it had been filtered out all this story and to just fix it in as a tool and instrumentalized for the production. So yeah, I think I just want to throw this also in the conversation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for me, like, firstly, thinking about this idea of knowledge and this kind of separation or binarization between, like, Anglo-European scientific knowledge and, I think you said elsewhere, kind of locally bounded knowledge, right? And what kind of knowledge is even allowed to circulate? I mean, I guess the question that I would put into there is, well, then we need to really talk about what constitutes knowledge in the first place, and why are we creating definitions of knowledge that are inherently then exclusionary in that kind of way, or setting up a particular hierarchization of knowledge that is kind of, you know, putting scientific knowledge at the top of that pole, and then I suppose like what ethnographic knowledge or, you know, whatever kind of toward the bottom. And I think that that's kind of already something that needs to be thought about, because particularly in the work that I do, ethnographic knowledge, or the knowledge that people have about water, circulates freely all over the place. You know what I mean? Regionally, it is knowledge that circulates, you know, even globally, it's knowledge that circulates. So I think we need to begin with interrogating those categories a little bit first. I also think that, in the work that I do, knowledge comes from people's experiences of the world, what people know conceptually, experientially, through conversation with other peoples. And I think actually what was quite interesting to me is, because I was also born on a boat and grew up on an island, is how many of us here have got very intimate relationships with water and coming from islands. So I think that in itself, like even thinking about what draws us, as artists and researchers who come from islands and who know this with a very deep, intimate, visceral, embodied knowledge of like the weather systems of islands, the tidal patterns of islands, like all these kinds of things that you glean from somewhere through proximity over time, how does that also inform the knowledge that we have and the knowledge that we bring to the work that we're doing? Because that's a very different kind of experience as well as, someone that might not have grown up in that kind of environment or not have that kind of environment deeply embedded, within their body. So I think that's something that, for me, in terms of thinking about knowledge and again, like I said before, like moving away from this certainty of categories, like moving away from this idea that something has to be known in a particular kind of sense. Like even in the Mining the Deep piece, what I find really interesting about oral testimonies about people's stories is that I will never know what is actually happening. There's always so much that is unsaid. There's so much that cannot be, categorized or pinned down in a particular kind of way. There are so many relations with water that cannot be articulated in particular kinds of ways. And I think that those things are, by far the most like kind of potentiate things in there, is those things that fall outside of any kind of like knowledge arena in that kind of sense.
I mean, that's so much what I like about that project and what you were talking about with restage, or what we've been talking about with restaging, because you have these lived experiences and there are people talking about what they think is happening subsurface and these noises, and then your ability to synthesize those creatively and put them in a form that we're now listening to them elsewhere as a way of saying this is a type of local knowledge that's circulating, but through this totally different means of restaging. And it's like, I think for me, it's a really evocative outcome of a number of the projects that you guys are working on in that way, that we're changing that definition of what we think knowledge is, in terms, and how to circulate it. It's not about measuring, it's not about creating a taxonomy that we then fit these things into. And it's, I think, a really strong outcome of a number of these pieces.
Yeah, and also to add to that, because you were talking, for sure, this is like a very important aspect, like the gap of like translatability between like the lived experience and like the actually bodily experience of like being in the water or being at sea and like not being mappable or not for more than a second. And but also I was thinking a lot of what you said about the logic of extraction and the externalities of like knowledge extraction, not only that of resource extraction, that is not always accounted for in the equation of monetary value and like value in general, but like the logic of that. For example, the extractive logic that drives exploration at sea is the logic that also drives tech innovation that allows for the discovery of like new resources or for the discovery of the need of protection for some resources, for example, like marine fauna and like, but other kinds of like mapping toxicity, for example, that derive from extractive practices. So I'm thinking also about this in terms of like knowledge ecology and the fact that like how knowledge circulates. And I think a lot about the fact that while looking through all of these documents about exploration and treaties and like all the different stakeholders that are involved in this equation, they mentioned that only 21% of the seabed is mapped. And so this is like a very useful model also for thinking about knowledge, that like we really, there is so much more that we don't know. And so we have to think about this as a model of like how to work with uncertainty and how to work with the submerged or the unmapped. And also I thought about somehow like a parallel with like a recent statistic about the fact that like 80% of like academic papers are not read ever, not even by the people that are involved in that field. And like then also I found recently through Antonia like a paper that is very, very related to this like operational metaphor of like using like the language of like the different states of water to think about like knowledge. And this happened like, I don't know, maybe 8 years ago. And maybe there are so many papers that talk about the same thing, but can never have an impact because they don't circulate in a certain way. So this kind of like knowledge in terms of like ecology and redundancy and like what is mapped and what is unmapped and what we don't know, I think it's also very interesting.
I think just to add to what you're saying as well, I remember like a couple of years ago, some video footage came out where they sent some machines down into the Mariana Trench. And remember that first footage that came out of like the deep sea creatures in the Mariana Trench, like the fluorescent ones, and like, you know, you just saw these creatures having these like lights shone onto them. And they just, when I saw that, I was like, there is so many things that we should not know. Right? Like, it's not even about like, we don't know yet, you know, it's really like, we should absolutely not know. They do not need somebody like poking a camera in their face or like being photographed in this kind of way. And there's absolutely no way to even know what the impact of this kind of behavior is even going to be. But there's something really in there for me as well about like what is not for us to know, and that kind of colonialist impulse to always like know everything, to claim everything, to chart everything, to document everything, to take everything all the time, rather than actually just kind of saying, you know what, that place is very dark and it's very deep, and there are things down there that, you know, just, they're not for me, you know, and so maybe we should just leave that as it is, you know. And I think that is also something that doesn't come into this conversation about knowledge, is the idea that it's always like, it's best to know, or like we need to pursue knowledge at all costs. And it's like, just leave them alone, you know, just leave it alone, you know. And so I think that's something that also needs to be brought into that kind of conversation. Like, maybe we don't need to sit here and define like other terminologies or other kinds of conceptualizations. Like, maybe it's also just best to be left.
Yeah, I think that, okay. I think that resonates very nicely with Shannon Mattern's talk. I think it was yesterday.
Yeah.
When she was talking about reduction, and not only as a method of like covering, but also as a way of caring for things. Yeah, I think it's a beautiful resonance. Yeah.
Yeah, I also just want to add, like, also from this aspect of visibility and invisibility, and like what should be known, what should be actually better left not known. But also I want to address that also it's interesting to think what is visible but it's blind. There's a blind spot, like it's there, we always see it, but we forgot or we didn't challenge that so far. So I think that also quite connected to what we are working, also this practice of restaging. Yeah.
Sorry, and also there's an alternative to knowledge, which is wonder, right? I do prefer wonder. And yes, as you're saying, that maybe we can wonder about what is in the unknown, or we can wonder about other things, and that's for me, that's a beautiful disposition and stance, because it engages curiosity, it requires openness. So yeah, I would argue for wonder rather than stable categories of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we like put that as one of the things on the manifesto that comes out of this, right? That like,
Yeah.
what are practices that inspire curiosity, wonder, engagement, rather than representation and knowability and things that can be plugged into models.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is jumping, or maybe it does relate a little bit, but I'm going to ask a question from Su Yu's project, Particular Waters. And when I was reading, you provided me with a longer script, which I really appreciated. You discussed 3 scales, and that you say that due to real discontinuities, that's a quote, you have 3 scales that sort of can't be synthesized. You know, there's molecular waters, local waters, and then the hydrosocial cycles of the chip manufacturing plant and their way of working with waters you kind of discussed a little bit ago. And I'm curious about these real discontinuities amongst the scales. And it's interesting that they apply to water, given that there's a common assumption that water aggregates so easily. And we can sometimes mistake it to have the same properties at each scale. And yeah, we have so many examples of how that's not true. And for me, I was just trying to think, I wrote that and then was like, well, I have to provide an instance. And it's nearly impossible for us to look at a glass of water and find anything intrinsic about it that would imply tidal forces or storm surges and things like that. And so I'm curious, for you, what were the things that established these sort of discontinuities? What were the things that made them need to be separated? And what are the intrinsic properties of water that you observed as these scales change? What gets lost when you have to jump scale and represent water a different way from between the molecular and the local? What do we no longer know about water when we're shifting between these scales?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think maybe I can start with what I said about real discontinuities. And I think as an example, I think most of us might know the film Powers of 10 by Charles and Ray Eames. And I think that also can help, can be an example for me to address this real discontinuities. And in this film, I just kind of described a bit from there's a couple in the park in Chicago, and this camera, cosmic camera, zoom out from Chicago and then to the universe and back to the human skin and to the cells. And I think this I would like to say is about this discontinuities which needs to be addressed, is that this kind of zoom out effect by scale could kind of blind us, or could be a kind of illusion, although it's also a construction of the vision part of that, but it could be a kind of illusion for us to thought that things could be this, can be built up, or this just one concept can be applied on this multiple scale without disruption. So I think it's really important to address in this, there's a certain limitation and also constraint in each of scales, which shouldn't be in this kind of smoothest, seamless continuity. Yeah, so I think that that film can be quite good example for that, and I think also can blend into our thinking about scale. And yeah, and about the project I'm working on at the moment about the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, and just giving a background story of the company, which the company produce mostly 84% of the chip around the world. But this project as I address is I'm looking at in 3 scales of water, as I mentioned earlier about molecular water, which especially this ultra pure water, which they use, and second cells about local waters, which this water conflict in the local level have been also widespread in international news due to the 2021 drought in Taiwan, and that this drought also further stress the global supply chain of computer chips. So I think that's this looking into the local scale of this conflict of industrial waters and agricultural water and domestic water, and that's I'm also looking much closely, talking to people, working with activists, and to listen to the places how this drought and can play a role, or how climate can play a role in this global supply chain, chip supply chain. Yeah, and then the next cell about the hydrosocial cycle of the TSMC, and that is then this for me is also a next scale. But this also, you can see this continuity about this water cycle, and that is quite conflict, or this is also image quite different than this concrete image what we have about hydrological cycle. It's always with arrows about rain and to land, but that is also the absence of social, absence of human activity in this diagram, which embedded in everyone's mind. Yeah, and so yeah, I think the next level of TSMC, I take the draw as a starting point to look into this chip and how the semiconductor geopolitics, like how it plays a role in the national security of Taiwan and states. Yeah, and further note is like, yeah, this company TSMC have been invited by states to open their new manufactory in Arizona. So that's also quite interesting for me to further look in this also different climate, different kind of water politics, and also this impose like industry on the landscape, and also how it creates another not only water conflict and also spatial conflict in the local scale. Yeah, so I think.
It's fascinating to me. It feels related to a little bit of what Laura was saying, in terms of the gap between like water and the sort of economic representation of it, that if we just think of it as an input into a process or a plant, we lose this larger geography that you just described at this broader scale. They're not thinking about it at that scale, but that a drought produces a vast geography just through one chip. And I think that's really fascinating. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that in the work that you've been doing.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot about this aspect of scale and scalability, and also in terms of like how these definitions that are decided by a very limited group of people and group of their disciplinary specialism then are applied at scale. And like this is also one of the first more intuitive colonial projects of like dividing the territory into equal units, and like trying like with the assumption and the delusion of that you can apply all these different very specific and contingent laws to every single grid. And so water and the ocean really evade this kind of attempted constraint. But in terms of scale, not only I think about this aspect of applying and leveling everything to the same unit, including and especially the units of time. I'm thinking about the scale of destruction, for example, and like the fact that whenever there is like an accident that involves like water, may it be an accident related to the exploration of the seabed, and then the damage and the scale of the damage can be up to irreversible and can affect the entire planet. And just because of like a single accident, or that is either man-made or natural, or because of like a slow moving change in the composition of the biochemistry of the ocean, or because, for example, some countries or configuration of countries decide that it is worth to build a dam in a river to generate electricity for that specific area, which will have consequences and a cascade of consequences at scale. So I always think about the aspect of like how it's impossible to decide at national level and at local level on issues that are related to water, because it's like the most physical manifestation of the planetary, and the fact that like scale really has a reach that sometimes can have literally no limits, and can really be irreversible. So in a way, like when we're thinking about developing this model using water as a like an operational metaphor. If any forms of governance would be based on water, it would have to be planetary scale, it would have to be transient, and it would have to be temporary. Also because of like the fact that its states change across time. I'm often thinking also about how the scale of damage of all of these extractive practices are measured in the legal documents, in the legal terms of the mining code, for example, that they're trying to approve. And some of the indicators are like a time-lapse photography of a 1 year, like of a specific grid in one of the maps, and who decides that this is the time frame where something happens? Because if the time frame it's a little bit longer, maybe that at that point you would detect a change. Otherwise, maybe you wouldn't. So always like in terms of also what you were talking about in your presentation about contrast and what you see and what you extract as signal amongst the noise, it's much more difficult to detect when you're talking about water, and it's much more difficult to predetermine if our time frame is the human life and not like deep time, for example.
Yeah, I was thinking about scale and building up on what Laura was saying is about like what is the right scale of something, and also related to wonder but mostly attention. Like when you give attention to something, it like magnifies, right? It's kind of like applying a magnifying glass to something, so it acquires a new scale. But again, the question is, as Laura was saying, what is the right scale when something magnifies, or what happened when you give something enough attention in terms of the relation with other things. So, yeah, no, it's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, there was a phrase that Laura used that I actually want to jump back to you in a second, so get ready. But you talked about water as a metaphor, and you've been talking about organizations and institutions, and I'm thinking of the economy too as like one of these main things that has often been described through water as a metaphor. Like if you try to look up diagrams of a national economy, there's always cartoons of a bathtub representing investment and flows, and even our dynamic systems models, right? Like the language we use to describe them, stocks and flows. And certainly in the mid-century, there were physical machines trying to describe a national economy actually flowing water through different things at different rates. And when I think about that, I think about the infrastructure that we use to channelize water, especially if we're first thinking about it metaphorically, and then it comes back and actually reflects how we treat hydrology as an engineering system. And when I saw holy water out in the hallway, in the lobby there, there's a moment that was showing water. I love this one moment. It was flowing out of a faucet and just directly into the drain for a moment. And I don't know how significant this was for you, but like maybe it's just when I walked into it, I like latched onto it, thinking about our conversation that we're going to have today. Because when it's flowing out of the faucet, the water's classified one way, right? It's clean water, it's tap water, potable water, and without any changes to the water at all. So it's coming out of one pipe, and we classify it one way. Without any modification to the water itself, the moment that it hits the drain, it becomes classified by a civic entity as completely different. It becomes gray water, it's waste. It's not allowed to enter into a certain set of circulation. We can't use it for certain things. And it gets connected to sewer systems. And there's no change in the water at all. It's just the channel that we send it through. And so this moment, it demonstrates how we channelize water, we constrain it, and in the process of this, it's connected to the way we categorize water. To physically constrain it is to limit the manifold of its potential. It's no longer infinite. And then elsewhere in the film, we see footage of water left to its own tendencies to follow kind of micro-terrains based on surface geometry, which is always like really beautiful to watch. And then that's juxtaposed with, I'm sure those of you who've seen the film, there's a moment where there's driving along the edge of Lake Michigan. And for me, I'm not necessarily thinking about the lake or the water, I'm thinking about that hard edge. And And it's a wall that actually determines the physical boundary of Lake Michigan, and it's sort of establishing as fact the boundary that's drawn cartographically that says this is the lake, this is not the lake. So as we're talking about disciplining water with categories and words, I'm curious about the ways that these words are entangled with physical infrastructure, that they reinforce each other. And then if we're kind of, if it seems inscribed in the world, it tends to naturalize it, and we're thinking about other ways of relating to water, and we're thinking of other cosmologies, other ontologies. Are there different infrastructures we could imagine that support a different understanding of water? Imagining that it's still going to relate to humans through some sort of techne. How might we do that? And that's like massive speculation, but I'm also wondering if there are kind of historical examples or examples from other cultures that we find to be inspiring. How do they work with water without just letting it be water? How do we mediate that experience with water that suggests a different ontology? Not classified, channelized route that we see so much of in our urban infrastructure. And this is open to anyone, but I thought your film really highlighted that for me, and your collaboration.
Yeah, thank you. And also you were mentioning the word choreography, and I think that's pretty much what is happening there and what can be explored through this idea of like the amount of like how that vignette, for example, shows a particular water choreography that entails, as you were saying, like what is waste and what is like a resource that you can use, and what is the limit of this water and how it channels. So for example, in the case of the avocado farming, that was one of the focal points of the exploration. You have an idea of like, around that avocado farming, you have an idea of like what is water, for whom, how it circulates, how it's valued. It's a commodity, it's a human right, all that kind of things. And I really like what the same anthropologist that I was mentioning, Andrea Ballesteros, she talks about like the poetics of the grammars of calculation, and how we approach water. For example, how water is priced, or and all that kind of engagement that are like between material and abstract, but also thinking about like models of governance or other inspiring things. Because of the difficulty of doing this, that's why Laura and I, we were like engaging with this idea of like how to stretch the imaginary toward other possibility of thinking and hydrocommons, and these examples were kind of like vignettes for exactly for understanding the hydro choreographies around a particular stance, but also denaturalizing that, because a lot of things, a lot of like what is happening with the avocado farming is a very dramatic representation of what happened with the financialization of water, where like financialization affects flows, create landscapes, distribution, population, displacement. So yeah, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that because there is like this like reduction to the financial aspect of water, and the fact that it's more valuable to farm avocados and sell it for 1 or 3 euros in Berlin than to use it for drinking and for agriculture there in Chile. I'm thinking also about again the scale and like the different scales at which all of these like resources are applied, and I'm thinking of how, for example, just one single policy that would be, for example, that water has to be free and cannot be sold, cannot be monetized into a plastic bottle that is just financial matter, basically, would also have a huge scale of impact in terms of like, I don't know, pollution and like the production of plastic and like negative incentive for the production of plastic, and just because of like one single law that doesn't even entail any like technological innovation, it's just like one decision about deciding what is this kind of entity, what is the value of this entity, and what other like positive externalities it can create just by this one measure. We were using it like also a little like a vignette in the libretto about the fact that because of the assumption that there was like a terrorist attack like 15 years ago, there was this restriction about like bringing liquids across in airports, and it turns out that it was just an attempt. It was not even something that actually happened, and this created a planetary scale measure that hasn't been questioned ever since. But this means that like everybody has to buy plastic bottles in the airports multiple times just because water is not free, and it should be, and it could be accessible if someone decided, if it was decided at scale that this was, it's like a kind of like a sacred value, so that you cannot contain it into financial matter made of plastic.
Thank you. We're getting down to the end here, so, I mean, there's already a hand up. Okay, you can anticipate where I'm going with this. Yes, okay. Questions from the audience, this particular audience member? I'm not sure if there's a mic that's going around. Yeah, okay. Great.
Is it on? Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the panel discussion. I have a question that is maybe particularly directed to Laura and Antonia. I'm very interested in the idea of the hydro commons, and I was wondering what your assumptions or starting points were when you were thinking about the idea of a hydro commons, because just to give you some context, I'm writing my thesis currently about the drained swamplands in northwest of Berlin, and these landscapes were also historically extracted or drained because of peat extraction, and later its wetness or water regime was operationalized itself, actually, because you also use the operational metaphor for agricultural regimes. And I also kind of have to come up with sort of, not a solution, but with an idea how these sort of water-human relationship can change in that landscape. And I also thought about the commons, or commoning idea. But for me, it's still kind of hard to wrap my head around where to start, you know, like, do we start with a legal system? Is it about practices or knowledges? Because in that particular landscape, it's really like, it's conflict, you know, because they don't have enough water to bring it back into the landscape, because it's also emitting CO2. That's why it's a political actor right now. But it can also not continue with business as usual, because it's too harmful. So where to start? And your particular project, where did you start with the idea of a hydro commons?
Want to jump?
Just briefly, I just wanted to say that I think it's like at all levels, it's important to think through, like at the level of expanding the imagination about what it can be, at the level of legal definitions, and at the level of like how its value is socially constructed, and through time its value changes, and also the fact that it's not inherently something that has, you know, that is like a sacred, natural resource, but it can also generate, like as Antonia was saying, yeah, it can also generate damage. So it's not like, it's something that doesn't, it's not like good or bad necessarily. And so that's why also Antonia was thinking about this kind of like post-ethical aspect, that it depends on like contingency. So I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. We were also wrapping our heads about the hydro commons, so that's why we were like using these examples as thinking through, and we were like stretching this idea of like what it was not including the installation, but something that was part of the research, that thinking about like a set of fundamental rights, or we call like elemental rights for water, but try to think like, okay, for example, there's a river in Quebec that now has a legal personhood, and the river has the right to flow, for example. And that sounds kind of like makes sense, but if you stretch that that principle, what does it mean, right? So that all that kind of things we don't have at all a solution, but we're very interested in thinking through these possibilities and what does it mean? Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question back here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion and conversation. Maybe this question is very vague or rhetoric, I don't know, but when you were discussing and when you were thinking about the title of how water calculates, and then how we're using the measurements, and then how we delegate this measurement things to technologies since centuries, this tools needs calibration. So what calibration means for you when you are working with the tools that you are using for measuring or thinking. It doesn't need to be also tools, but what is your thinking thoughts about this calibration?
You guys?
Oh no, I think it pertains a lot more to the work that you do.
Well, we were thinking, first we were thinking through a device, right? Like in this case, the vignette was kind of a device, but the idea of like trajectory and pilgrimage was also a device. So I think it's very interesting and useful to think, to use a device or a research device to think through, right? Because it has like you're not forced to scale that. It can be like self-contained and can be calibrated within. So that's for me like a very useful ontological device for thinking through things. But also, like you were talking about like calibration, and sorry if I'm like mentioning Andrea Ballesteros way too much, but I think her work is fantastic. But she addressed exactly the grammar of calculation on how water is evaluated, for example, in your like water bill, even in places where water is thought as a human right. But that kind of thing, like, is charging for water, does charging for water convert that into a commodity? Like, and who calculates that, and in which sense? So like in terms of like abstract devices that create reality and materiality, I think there's a lot that is taken for granted, and we are like in general between like thinking of matter as directly as possible, or thinking in like theoretical terms, but there's like these other devices that are our daily engagement with things that are very wondrous and provocative, and yeah. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. We're out of time here. I think I'd like to just give our panelists a moment if they wanted to have any last thoughts. Just quick summary comments at the end, or no, you're out. Okay. On down the road, you. Verbal confirmation from each of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.